Clock though. So let us get started. And before we get started, as soon as we have a couple more straggle in, Steve, can I pick on you? Would you direct our minds in a word of opening prayer?
Let's bow together. Our Father, we're thankful for the opportunity to study your word. We're thankful that Rex is willing to teach his class. Father, help us to glean from your word the many lessons that we can learn from the book of Numbers now, and how God dealt with his people many years ago. We know that you are the same God today as you were then, and you would expect the same from us as you would expect from them in obedience. Guide us in this study and let us learn. It's through Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen. So, according to my notes, we ended on chapter 12 last week, and we're going to start in chapter 13, which is good because this is the beginning of really the second or third section of the book of Numbers. And it runs chapter 13 through chapter 20, and we find Israel where? Can anybody tell me? I'm sorry? Oh, Paran. We're going to see that they haven't gone very far in a few verses, and they're now in the wilderness of Zin. So I'm not really sure. I'm sure they didn't have dotted lines even on the maps to indicate where the one wilderness started and another didn't. But they're near a town, the town of Kadesh. And remember what happened at Kadesh? Anybody remember what happened? Israel ran into the biggest problem that they ran into during their exodus. What was the problem?
Their attitude.
Well, I agree with that. Their attitude, you know, what was their attitude?
Well, they focused against Moses.
Yeah, who did they focus on?
Against God.
I'm sorry?
Against God.
Against, well, if you think about it, did they really, if something goes wrong in your life, do you point your finger at God and say, God, why did you do this to me? Now, sometimes we do say, why me? Well, we don't see the Jews, you know, looking at God and say, Jehovah, you really messed up. Why'd you do this to us? Who do they pick on? Moses. Okay, Moses and Aaron are the ones that are the target. And they're going to be the target for how long? Well, probably at least as long as we're going to be looking at them in the book of Numbers. But at Kadesh is where they made the decision to do what? They send the spies, okay? And that's where we're going to start in chapter 13, okay? Numbers 13, verses 1 through 3. God commanded Moses about the spies. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send out for yourself men so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of your father's tribes, every one a leader among them. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran at the command of the Lord, all of the men who were heads of the sons of Israel. And then if we look at verses 17 through 20, we see the instructions that Moses gives to the spies. Let's go through there quick. He sends the spies out to Canaan, verse 17. Go into the Negev. Then Negev is where? In Israel? The south. It's the southern portion, okay, between the mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. That's where the Negev is, because that's going to come up a couple times tonight, okay? Go into the Negev, okay? Then go up where? Up to the hill country. Go up to the hill country. He's told them to go. Did he tell them to stay out of anywhere in the land of Canaan? Remember, we're talking about Canaan now. We're not talking about Israel yet. We're talking about the physical land of Canaan. And he tells them, no, go everywhere. Go to the Negev, which is in the south. Go to the hill country, which tends to be in the north, okay? See what the land is like. What does he care about the land? I'm sorry?
They want to take the land.
Yeah, well, but why do they want to take the land? All of you farmers, raise your hand and tell me why land's important.
To raise crops.
Yeah, you got to raise crops. You got to keep your flocks on it, your herds on it. You have to have land to do that. So that's what he's talking about. And so he goes on, see what the land is like, whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many. How is the land which they live? Is it good or bad? How about their cities? Okay, are they open camps or fortifications? What's he talking about? Fortifications, specifically, one walls. Okay, are they walled? Okay, if they're walled, that's where they have fortifications. How is the land? Fat or lean? What's he talking about? Fat or lean? Yeah, is it rich or poor? You know, are the people that are living there, are they rich or are they poor? Because how's God going to give them the land? Just like it is now. Keep that in mind. That's what God told them. You're going to get the farms with what on it? All the crops. Everything's going to be growing, okay? Everything's going to be growing. And so that's what he's talking about in verses 17 through 20. And so they go, and then they come back. And in 25 through 33, what kind of report do the 10 spies give us? Oh, come on, you guys know the answer to this. A bad one, okay? Okay? They give him a bad one. Okay, verse 27 and 28. Thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. It brought back some grapes, apparently a very large cluster of grapes, much larger than we normally think of grapes. At least that's the impression that I get as I read it. So the land is what? It's what God said it was. Yeah, and then verse 28. Starts out with a terrible word. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Okay? Anak supposedly was what?
Giant.
They were giants. Okay? They were giants. Verse 29, Amalek is living in the land. In the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites are living in the hill country. The Canaanites, which is another word for Amorites, by the way, are living in the sea and by the side of the Jordan. Hey, there's a lot of people in there. Do you suppose they expected just to walk in and, you know, everybody's going to leave and just leave it for them and they're going to get it? They're not going to have to do anything at all? You kind of get that impression, okay? And then in verses 30 and 31, the report of Joshua and Caleb. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. How are they going to overcome it?
God's help.
With God's help, okay? God was going to be on their side. This being that had walked him across in the dry sand of the Red Sea, who had been with him all along, that's who's going to help him. Then we get to 14, and I'm just going to read the first two verses to begin with. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. All the sons of Israel grumbled against who? Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Have we heard that story before? Yep, same people, heard the story before. Would that we had died in this wilderness or in Egypt. We're going to see that they have a very short memory of how things were in Egypt. A very short memory. And so in verse 4 they say, let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Let's go back and be slaves again. In verses 6 through 10 of the 14th chapter, Joshua and Caleb speak to the people. Verse 8, if the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. They've already said, yes, it's a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. What's a prey? Somebody said it. It's what you go hunting for. Okay? It's the object that, if you're out looking for deer, your prey is the deer. Okay? And that's what it's talking about. That's what it's going to be for this army of Israel. God's going to be on their side. There is no bigger force, for want of a better term, on the battlefield than God. If God's on your side, Romans 8:31, 6:31, Romans 6:31, if God be for us, who can be against us? Nobody that has any meaning whatsoever. And sometimes we lose track of that. They certainly lost track of it here. Let's look at verses 11 and 12, and we'll see how God responds to Israel's rebellion. The Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? How long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? Do you sense that there's some frustration with Israel on God's part? If you were God, would you be frustrated with Israel? I know I would. I mean, I've done all of these things for them, okay? I've provided what for them? Manna, quail, water. I guess God didn't give them a car to drive across the desert in. They had to walk, okay? But the bottom line is God's taking care of them. In another passage, it'll tell us, what about their shoes? Do you remember? They never wore out. What about their clothing? It never wore out. God took care of them. God provided them everything that they needed. Okay? What did they see? They didn't. All that they saw was God didn't give them all the same thing we think about sometimes. He didn't give them all the things that they wanted. Okay? He gave them all the things that they needed to survive, to have a good life, okay? But that wasn't enough. Typically human. Numbers chapter 14, verses 11 and 12. We see God's response, okay? He talks about, how long are we going to put up with this? Okay? In verse 13 through 19, Moses offers a prayer for the people. Why does Moses pray for the people? What is his fear? Yeah, he's afraid of the anger of God. What's God already threatened to do more than once, or at least once before? To destroy the people, okay? To destroy the people. And then who was he going to raise up followers from? From Moses himself, okay? Moses, we'll start a new exodus with you being the man, okay? Physically as well as spiritually. Verse 19. Moses' prayer, pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you also have forgiven the people from Egypt even until now. God knew what his job was. One of the jobs that he had was to intercede for the people, to stand between the people and Jehovah. Don't you think that's a tough position to be in? Particularly when how much appreciation do the people have for the interceding that he was doing? Not very much. Because time and again, and we'll continue to see that through the rest of the book of Numbers, they complain, okay? And then in verses 20 through 38, we see God's further response to the rebellion, okay? His response to Moses' prayer in verse 20, I have parted them according to your words, but indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs which I have performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of them who spurned me see it. How many warriors was that? What was the count? 603,550. That's how many of the warriors did not go into the land that they've been traveling to get to. In Numbers, the 14th chapter, verses 25 through 29 and 32 through 35, we see that God does what to Israel? Who was Israel frightened of there in verse 25? Still chapter 14. The Amalekites and the Canaanites, okay? Amalekites lived in the south, Canaanites lived in most of the rest of Canaan. Live in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out to the wilderness, by the way of the Red Sea. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation who are grumbling against me? What have they done this time? What have they not done? They haven't gone in to take the land. God says, go in and take the land. It's yours. I give it to you. Okay? And then in verse 29, he says, say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness, even all your numbered men, according to your complete number from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Everyone except for Caleb and who? Joshua. Caleb and Joshua. Okay, Caleb and Joshua are the two that were obedient. They were set to go. Okay, all the rest, they fell in the wilderness. And in Numbers 14:31, your children, however, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring them in, and they will know the land which you have rejected. So the next generation, and we'll start, Kevin's going to be dealing with Deuteronomy in a couple of weeks. Well, maybe more than a couple, but a few weeks anyway. Whenever I'm done, okay. So what happens to the spies who give the false report? First of all, is their excuse me, is their report false as to the facts of the situation? No, it's not. No, it's not. What makes their report false?
They didn't trust God.
They did not trust God. Okay? You're never going to look at that generation as an example of faith. Only two men in that generation were an example of faith. That's Joshua and Caleb. So God does what? Sends a plague. Okay? A plague on the spies of the false report. Now this plague apparently only hit the spies. sent to spy out the land. They grumbled against him. Even those men who brought out the very bad report of the land died by a plague before the Lord. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb remained alive out of those men who went to spy out the land. So chapter 14, verses 39 through 45, Israel gets into a fight and they lose. Why'd they lose? In the morning, God told him what to do, what he was going to do. Verse 40, in the morning, however, when they rose up early and went up to the ridge of the hill country, saying, "Here we are." Who were they talking to? Presumably. Here we are. God, probably. "We have indeed sinned." Okay, and you can tell by what we're about to do that we really are not repentant, right? How do you know that they really weren't repentant of their sin? Because they're about to do what they're told not to do. Verse 42, "Do not go up, or you will be struck down before your enemies, for the Lord is not among you." You want to go up and fight? The only thing you're going to do is die. Okay? "For the Amalekites and the Canaanites will be there in front of you, and you will fall by the sword, inasmuch as you have turned back from following the Lord." They rejected the Lord, so what did the Lord do? What's our saying? Turnabout's fair play? No? They rejected the Lord, so the Lord said, "Okay, you're not going to get what I promised you could have." Chapter 15, we're going to get through pretty quick because it's really laws of offerings. That's what it's all about. Laws making offerings by native Jews when in Canaan. So these were the laws that actually not this generation, but then will apply to the next generation when they get into Canaan. And you see that in verses 1 through 13. And then it's interesting, in 14 and 16 of chapter 15, okay, we read about the law of the sojourner. "If an alien sojourns with you, or one who may be among you throughout your generations, and he wishes to make an offering by fire as a soothing aroma to the Lord, just as you do, so he shall do." So, what's God accepting from sojourners, from those that live in Israel? Offerings. Offerings that they make to God are acceptable to God. Okay? "As for the assembly, there shall be one statute for you and for the alien who sojourns with you, a perpetual statute throughout your generations, as you are, so shall the alien be before the Lord. There is to be one law and one ordinance for you and for the alien who sojourns with you." So if you lived in Israel and you weren't a Jew, okay, if you follow the Jewish religion, because I think that's what it's talking about here, God's going to accept your offerings. Numbers 15 continued in verses 22 through 26, okay? "But when you unwittingly fail," that is, fail in what? Keeping the law, okay? That is, it's talking about sin. "And do not observe all these commandments which the Lord has spoken to Moses, even all that the Lord has commanded you through Moses, from the day when the Lord gave commandment and onward through your generations, then it shall be, if it is done unintentionally without the knowledge of the congregation," this is the whole congregation committing a sin. That's what it's talking about, okay? "All the congregation shall offer one bull," and it goes into the offering that they have to make. And then in the 27th verse of the same 15th chapter, it talks about the individual. Also, if one person sins unintentionally, then he shall offer a 1-year-old female. And again, it goes in and gives specifics about what had to be offered, because God was very specific about that. And then, as he has spoken of earlier, it's the same law whether you're an alien or whether you're a sojourner. Okay? However, verses 30 through 31 are the ones that are really what I think of as being critical. Verse 30, but the person who does anything defiantly. In other words, what are they doing? How would we put it today? Intentional. In your face. Okay? They know God's law, and they're going to do what they want to do. That one is blaspheming. That person shall be... How are they blaspheming? They've turned against God. By their behavior, they're saying God's law is not valid. It's not true. God is not God. Because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment, that person shall be completely cut off. His guilt will be on him. And I'll say this again, and I'll be more than happy to study with whoever wants to say it. Most of the time, when you see a person has been completely cut off, what does that mean? They're killed. Okay? They're killed. That's what it means. Not all the time, but most of the time, if you look at the context, you'll see that that's where it ends up.
So you're saying that they're physically killed?
Yes.
They don't have a chance to go to heaven?
Oh, I don't know if they have a chance to go to heaven. I don't make that decision.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you say,
They die.
well, when they're cut off, that doesn't mean that they're not going to heaven. It means they die.
Yes. Yeah, the cutoff only has, they are cut off from the people. So that they can't, if you're cut off from the people, who can you not have association with? If you're cut off from the people, where can you not go? Where do you have to go to worship God? This is not a tough question, folks. Where did the Jew have to go to worship God? They had to go to the tabernacle, okay? They had to go through a priest, okay? If you're cut off from the people, you can't go to the tabernacle. You can't go see the priest. Guess who you're cut off from? You're cut off from God. Kevin, did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, that's why it talks about their guilt remains on them. In that whether they die or not die, their guilt is there, and they have no way of being able to come back without repentance. That's not addressed.
That is true, it's not. The bottom line is, who are they making themselves equal to? They're making themselves equal to God, okay? Interesting question, present day, okay? When we act defiantly and break God's law, who are we making our God? And if your finger's not pointing back at yourself, then it's pointing the wrong way. We need to be careful. Same thing can happen to us. We can be cut off too, okay? I mean, I don't want to be cut off from the congregation, but more than that, I don't want to be cut off from God. And when you sin defiantly, when you sin intentionally, God hasn't changed his position. It's always been the same, okay? When you do that, you're separated from God. You don't have communion with God. You don't have a covenant relationship with God. Why? Not because God moved, because I did. Because I chose to do that. Okay. You want to read it?
It says, for if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries.
Hebrews 10:26. I mean, I don't know how much plainer it can get. Interesting. Then he talks about in verses 32 through 36. I think God, through Moses, gives us an example of an intentional sin. Okay. Now, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath. Oh, no big deal, right? I got to have a fire on the Sabbath. What's the big deal? You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Okay, in addition to the working, picking of the wood, he was gathering the wood to do what with it? Probably. Yeah. Build something, have a fire. That's work too. All those are no-nos. You don't do that. I say that kind of, we think of when somebody says, as I just said, a no-no, that's kind of trite. Okay? But it's coming in that booming voice from the top of Mount Sinai. Okay? That's who you're talking about. That's who you're defying. You're defying the creator of the universe. It has some downside to it. In chapter 15, verses 37 through 41, this is an interesting one. Moses talks about what? Seems kind of minor to me. Tassels. Okay, what's a big deal? Tassels, right? Well, go down to verse 39. It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord so as to do them and not follow after your heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot. What we were just talking about, okay? Why did they have the tassels? The tassels were to remind them of the commandments of God that they were supposed to be following. And then in chapter 16, this is a chapter where we run into an interesting individual, a gentleman named Korah, okay? Interesting fact about Korah, he was from what tribe? He was from the tribe of Levi, okay? He was a Kohathite, okay, according to verse 16. And he allied himself, or two men that allied with him were Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, okay? And then in addition to that, verse 2, and they rose up before Moses, together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. Who chose these men of renown to begin with? I'm pretty sure if you go back a few chapters, you'll find that at least some of them were picked by God. God expected them to follow through and to do what they were supposed to do. But they've decided they don't want to do that. They want to go against Moses and Aaron. They want to lead the people. They want to take the people back to Egypt. They want to take the people wherever the people want to go. They want to be in charge. That's the impression that I keep getting. Okay. In verse 3, interestingly enough, they make this false statement about Moses and Aaron. And they assembled together against Moses and Aaron, and they said to them, "You have gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy." Is that a true statement? God wanted the whole congregation to be holy, okay? A very small percentage of them were. And every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst, so why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? In Numbers, the 12th chapter, verse 3, what did God say about Moses and humility? He's the most, what? Humble man. Now, the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. And they're accusing Moses of not being humble. So the first thing that Moses does in response to Korah's charge is he really demonstrates his humility, doesn't he? Isn't it a sign of humility when someone falls on their face before you? Steve assures me that it is. Yeah, that's how I see it. And then Moses sets a meeting between himself and Aaron, and who? These rebels. Tomorrow we're going to have this meeting. It's going to be at 8 o'clock in the morning. Everybody show up. But who does Moses make sure is also invited? God. God's going to be there too. And God is going to do what? He's going to show you who's faithful. And it's interesting, Moses really condemns this group of the Levites that are involved in this rebellion in verses 8 through 11 in chapter 16. Let's just look at 8 and 9. Then Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself to do the service of the tabernacle and to stand before the congregation to minister to them?" Wow. Moses just lays it right on the line. It's not enough for you that you have been chosen specifically by God to be the priesthood. Amazing. Amazing that we can be so blind when it just is right in front of us. So Moses summons the principal allies and essentially accuses Moses of lying further about what he had committed to do for Israel. What had Moses committed to do for Israel? Where was he going to take them? The Promised Land. And every time I think of the Promised Land, I think of a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay? He says, hey, you haven't delivered. What's the problem? When we see a prize out there like a land flowing with milk and honey, when do we want that? Yeah, yesterday if possible. Okay, and if not yesterday, I'll take it right now. They have the same problem that sometimes we have too, and others have had that we've seen. You have to wait on God. It's God's schedule that's under consideration here, not mine. And it appears to me that in verse 15, a allegation of what today we would call profiteering is made against Moses. Then Moses became very angry and said to the Lord, "Do not regard their offering. I have not taken a single donkey from them, nor have I done harm to any of them." Why would Moses say that unless somebody had been alluding to the fact that they thought he had? We see that claim in the New Testament against whom? Another preacher of God's word. The Apostle Paul. Yeah, the Apostle Paul. So in 16 and 17 of the 16th chapter, Moses commands all of them to be present. You and all your company will probably, and this probably included some Jews who are not Levites. And Jews who are not Levites, how close could they get to the temple? I don't mean in feet or yards. They weren't supposed to be around it at all. They weren't supposed to be around it, or not the temple, excuse me, the tabernacle. Okay, different rules for the temple. Be present before the Lord tomorrow, both you and along with Aaron. Each of you take his fire pan and put incense in it, and each of you bring the censer before the Lord. 250 fire pans. Also you and Aaron shall each bring his fire pan. So we see in 18 and 19, these events occurred, and all the congregation was assembled. All the rest of the congregation that wasn't involved in this challenge, for want of a better term, are assembled there to do what? Witness it. See what's going to happen. So each took his own censer, put on it, and laid incense on it, and they stood at the doorway of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. And in verses 20 and 21, Moses warns, God warns Moses and Aaron. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, and I will consume them instantly. Who was going to be consumed?
Fight against God.
I think it was bigger than that even. The whole congregation. It seems to me that that's what he's saying is he's ready. He's, as sometimes we get with our kids, I've had it up to here. And it seems to me that that's what he's talking about. It's not just the ones that have been actually involved in the rebellion, but the ones who are standing along the sidelines, maybe not cheering them on, but certainly supporting them by the fact that they're there, assembled together. Anyway, and if you disagree with that, that's fine. That's just my interpretation of it. So in verse 22, Moses prays for God to spare the congregation. And what does God do? Spares the congregation. Because he tells Moses, God tells Moses to warn the congregation of impending peril. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 23, speak to the congregation, saying, get back from around the dwellings of Korah and Dathan and Abiram. And then what we find in verses 25 through 35, Moses really speaks prophetically. Then Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abiram with the elders of Israel following him, and he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart now from the tents of these wicked men, touch nothing that belongs to them, or you will be swept away in all their sin. Moving on to verse 28. By this ye shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these deeds, for this is not my doing. That's Moses speaking personally. It's not personally his doing what's about to happen. If these men die the death of all men, or if they suffer the fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that is theirs, and they descend alive into Sheol, then you will understand that these men have spurned the Lord. Verse 31, as he finished speaking all these words, the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, and their households and all the men who belonged to Korah with their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive to Sheol. Verse 35, fire also came from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. Guess what? Who was God talking through? Moses. Okay, Moses. How do we know? Because God performed a miracle. Moses said, if this happens, this is God. It's not me. Guess what? When it happened, everybody that was watching understood that was God, not Moses, that did that. Or at least you would think that, wouldn't you? We're going to find very shortly that that was not the case. So the next day, the very next day, okay, the congregation grumbles against Moses and Aaron because of the deaths caused by the destruction of the rebellious Korah and his allies. Verse 41, but on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, you are the ones that have caused the death of the Lord's people. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Verse 42, and it came about, however, when the congregation had assembled against Moses and Aaron, that they turned toward the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them instantly. Who did God threaten to consume? The whole congregation. The whole congregation. He was prepared to destroy them. 45 and 46, Moses and Aaron pray and intercede to save the congregation. 47 through 50, then Aaron took it as Moses had spoken and ran into the midst I'm sorry, I missed 46. Moses and Aaron said to Aaron, take your censer. This was the censer he brought to be with all the other censers and to test and see who God was going to give recognition to, and put on in it fire from the altar and lay incense on it, then bring it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone forth from the Lord. The plague has begun. And this wasn't a plague that made you sick. This was a plague that killed you. Then Aaron took it as Moses had spoken and ran into the midst of the assembly, for behold, the plague had begun among the people. He took the stand between the dead and the living, so that the plague was checked. Verse 49, but those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died on account of Korah. Well, it's 7:46 right now, so I'm going to stop right there. And next week, we'll start with chapter 17. And Aaron's rod that budded.